I always think about when you're looking at ARV, if you think you've pulled your comps, you need to go look at the pictures of those comps to make sure they're very similar houses.
And their next door neighbor's house was totally flipped and it sold for $250. So then they say, well, Joe's house across the street sold for $250. Yeah. That's what mine's going to sell for.
The fine line is speed and being careful.
Yeah.
Like that's the fine line.
You're going to have to hire an engineer, and they're going to have to do all the measurements, all this kind of stuff. And then you're going to have a truss company build these trusses. And I said, well, how are we going to get it in there? He said, you got to pull the roof off the top of the house. You got to drop them in from the
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Evernest Real Estate Investor Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Spencer Sutton, and I'm joined today with my co-host, Adam Hobson. Adam, welcome back to the show, man.
Thank you, Spencer. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been great. I've really enjoyed having you on the show because you're giving some of these stories you're giving us are hilarious. Like I just re-listened to the squatter one, and it was just fantastic. Well, so your pain is my gain.
That's right. I was about to say maybe somebody can get something from this misfortune that we have to go through sometimes.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that's the point, and that's going to be the point of this episode because we want to talk about probably what you consider the 5 biggest mistakes that real estate investors make when they flip houses. And so the way I've kind of thought about a real estate journey that a lot of people take is a lot of people start out wholesaling because you can do it, with little capital, very little capital, little investment, a lot of sweat equity. We talked about that in one of the episodes. And then sometimes people move up to, hey, I got such a great deal on this. Maybe I want to flip it. Maybe I want to rehab the entire house and sell it on the retail market. They get more comfortable with real estate and kind of understanding the market a little bit, and then maybe they go into holding rentals or doing owner financing, something like that. So that's kind of a progression I've seen. Yep. I think probably the biggest challenge and what we're going to talk about today is that jump from wholesaler to flipping, because you're going from just like trading a contract, right? Assigning a contract to somebody where you're not touching anything. You may go look at the house and you may do a rough estimate in your head of like how much work this needs because that helps you sell the property, kind of put a good price on it. Yep. But then let's talk about the challenges of going from just wholesaling to flipping. There's a ton more involved.
Yeah. Well, first, before I say that, let me say that I heard somebody else say this. Wholesaling it's like a gateway drug because like you start with wholesaling and then, you can start with very little barrier to entry, very little money. And then, as you build up some funds, you're like, well, maybe I could start flipping. And then maybe that leads to holding, like you're talking about, commercial, whatever it is. So the wholesaling is, that lower barrier to entry, like we mentioned on several other podcasts. But it's a good way to start. So I'll say that on, some of these houses that I flip, I don't flip 4 or 5 a month like some of these full-time flippers do. Right. Like I've said before, I usually pick the house, buy the house, and decide what I'm going to do with it, right? Gotcha. So, I can either hold it, flip it, do anything basically I want to with it, just turn around and resell it like it is. But I do like to kind of cherry pick the flips that I do. Sure. So,
but what was the mindset of that very first one? Like the first one you decided to flip. What made you decide, hey, I'm going to give this a shot?
So it was like, okay, I could either make a $20,000 wholesale fee, which is great, or based on the numbers, I could potentially make $60,000 on a flip. And I still am, toying with that some days because I'm like, hey, I can make a quick 20 right now and move on to it. And every time I flip a house, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore because you have to deal with contractors, you have to deal with agents, and like, what if the market crashes, all this kind of stuff. But making 20 versus making 60, make 20 now or make 60 in 3 or 4 months, it's pretty enticing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the biggest. You've made all these mistakes we're about to talk about. Yep. And I have not flipped houses, but I've done enough rehabs on rental houses that I can join in with you and talk about some of these. So do you want to talk about number one?
Sure, yeah. So that was not knowing the ARV of the area, right?
Okay.
So if you don't know, if you don't know what a house is going to sell for, you can't hit a target you can't see, right? So like, I mean, if you got a house that, you're buying for X number of dollars, you have to know what it's going to sell for after it's all fixed up, because you can't kind of reverse engineer the numbers. So ARV, for people who brand new in real estate, that's after repair value. This is what we can sell it for on the market if it's nice, fixed up, and everything's perfect, right? So not knowing the ARV in Birmingham, I think it's a little more challenging than other areas. You go to like a Arizona where it's like a big grid system, and there's only a few different types of houses, and there's just street after street. It's probably pretty easy to find the ARV. Where
right.
Here, now there are some easier areas. We talked about a place called Alabaster, Alabama, which is a good area. There's a lot of subdivisions over there. So if you have one subdivision with 200 houses, chances are you're going to be able to
have
find
some comps there.
Yep. So same floor plans, basic, same year built, all that kind of stuff. So I think finding the ARV is the hardest thing. And there's different softwares out there you can use. I mean, for like a down and dirty kind of, quick way, Zillow, you can use Zillow, not the Zestimate, because I think that's totally wrong.
That's not good. Right?
Yeah, no, but, you can see, okay, what houses have sold in the last year or two, in this same area. You just kind of get an idea. But I don't know if you want to chime in anything on the ARV.
Yeah, I mean, I always think about when you're looking at ARV, if you think you've pulled your comps, you need to go look at the pictures of those comps to make sure they're very similar houses. Because we deal with this in rentals as well. People are like, well, hey, a house rented just down the street for $1,500. And like, well, it's not the same house. This house is a lot newer, the square footage is way different. Bedrooms, bathrooms are way different. So just make sure your comp is truly a comp.
Yeah.
And it is harder in Birmingham, but I think there's some areas where it's still going to be challenging. But I'm just thinking about Nashville. You've got these municipalities like Brentwood and Franklin. There are very unique houses in each of these groups, but it's probably a little bit easier, because the crazy thing is in Birmingham, you have especially people who are thinking about flipping in some of these C and D class areas. You have to be very, very careful, because you may get like one big comp that you're betting everything on.
Yep.
Hey, this house in Inslee sold for $250,000, but crap, your house may not be worth $100,000.
Yeah.
I mean, you just have to be careful, because also the people trying to sell you these deals, they're also trying to sometimes push up these ARVs as high as they can.
That's right. So whenever somebody sends me, that's the number one thing. Whenever a wholesaler or an agent, not so much from the agents, because I mean, if they, typically I tell an agent, hey, if you bring me a deal, if I get it, I'll pay you a commission on the front, and I'll let you relist it on the back end too. That way they can kind of
shoot themselves in the foot by
for jacking it up. Yeah, because they know they're not going to be able to sell it. So if it was just a one-time, one and done, maybe. But most agents that I deal with are going to be respectful and say, hey, I don't think you can sell it for this. So I talked to one. I was looking at a house Friday. A friend of mine, she's a realtor, and I called her. I said, hey, do you think I could sell this for $440,000? And I saw some good comps in there, and she just she said, no, look, I think 415 is the best you're going to be able to do, because the market's not the same in this little area. So I just had to trust what she said, and I had to pass on the house. But anyway, yeah. So one thing too, I'm going at all this like nobody is ever, like this is the first time I've ever listened to a real estate podcast. Comps just stands for what? Comparable sales, comparables. I know you got it from the context, but that's just the houses in the, similar house, similar area, about the same size square footage that we can base, what we're going to sell the house for. Yep. So I will say one of the hardest things is when you go and talk to a homeowner and they're wanting to sell. Well, they may have a house that's from 1950s, brown stove, pink stove, whatever it is, those old appliances that are still working, but everything's just straight out of a catalog from the 50s. And their next door neighbor's house was totally flipped and it sold for $250. So then they say, well, Joe's house across the street sold for $250. Yeah. That's what mine's going to sell for. That's kind of the hardest thing, is trying to explain to them, about ARV and how theirs is updated and all that kind of stuff.
Well, not only that, but people have an attachment to their personal house.
Oh yeah, sentimental.
So it's much more personal, and they don't want to admit that their house, needs a lot of work. And it's like, hey, your house is horrible right now. For the market right now, it's just not a good house. And you've got to, obviously you want to do that with respect, but you have to be able to prove to them that, hey, your house and your neighbor's house are not the same house.
Yeah. What's different too when you come home every day at my house? I mean, I'm sure there's scuff marks and paint scrapes where kids have run into stuff, and I don't see it because I'm there every day.
Right.
Somebody else might walk in and be like, "Oh man, that needs to be repainted." Whatever it is, Sure. So this on a larger scale, kind of the same thing. They bought this in the 50s or 60s. They've lived there their whole life, so to them, oh yeah, we just remodeled, but that was 30 years ago.
Right, that's right. So. There's no doubt. All right, so that's the first big mistake that people can make flipping is just not knowing the ARV. That's very, very important. Okay, let's talk about number 2.
Yeah, so that would be not knowing the repair cost. And I know some of this may sound super obvious. Some of you are probably thinking, well, yeah, obviously, Adam, we're not stupid. You have to know what it's going to sell for. You have to know what the repair costs are, but you'd be surprised at the amount of new investors that just want to jump in and they make pretty common mistakes, Yeah, right. So, I've done this. I've doing it for a while. I try to know the ARV and the repair cost and all that, but sometimes you mess up, So anyway, second one, not knowing the repair cost. This is very hard, especially for, like we just mentioned, wholesalers sending you deals and everything. So if you've never flipped a house before, it's very hard to know how much it's going to take in repairs, right? And I've got a worksheet. I should have brought it, but it's like a down and dirty type of worksheet that'll give you a basic idea of what something needs, So like when you walk in, I know that a bathroom, if it's totally outdated and needs to be redone, I can pretty much say that's a $5,000, repair. So if there's 2 bathrooms, that's $5,000, $10,000, and then the kitchen's totally outdated, averages about $15,000 for a kitchen. So I know I'm at $20,000. I can look at a roof and say, okay, this size roof, that's about $8,000. HVAC's about $6,000. So, as you go along, you're going to know kind of, what your repair costs are going to be just by eyeballing it. But when you're first starting, it's hard. You have to find somebody that's in the business, right? So I would suggest if you don't know the repair cost, get somebody that does, right? So even if it's somebody that, a handyman, a contractor that maybe you're thinking about using, somebody that is reliable, maybe you've gotten referrals from or whatever, that they can walk through the house and say, hey, this is what it's going to take. And hopefully if they think you're going to use them, they'll be honest with you. And then once you walk so many houses, you're going to be able to figure out, hey, pretty quick how much it's going to cost. Because a lot of wholesalers will send me stuff, oh, it just needs $10,000. Well, these days you can't, that's not paint, maybe carpet. That's not very much. $10,000 doesn't go very far these days.
Yeah, and that's what we used to do. So we used to just go and eyeball things and say we kind of knew pretty much very basic everything was going to be at least $20,000.
Yeah,
it's kind of what we went in expecting at least $20,000, and then we were above or beyond or below that. Let me ask you this question: what about do you? Because we've seen people get a rough estimate. Let's just say they kind of get a very rough estimate and they say, hey, I think it's going to need $30,000 in work. And so they make their offer based on that and they get it under contract. And then they go send an inspector out. So they have a due diligence period. Maybe that's 7 days or 20 days. I don't know. And they go send their inspector out to go look at it and they get a whole list of stuff and then get repair quotes on that. Do you recommend that, or have you ever seen people do that?
Yeah, so it's hard. Well, I guess too, from what I hear back...
Kind of depends on who you're buying it from, right?
Who you're buying it from and kind of the market. Because from what I understand, back when you were doing it in the early 2000s, you were saying like you kind of got in on the ground level in Birmingham where you could go and just kind of cherry pick houses, right? For the most part.
That's right.
There was still probably competition, but you could say, hey, I'll get back with you in 3 or 4 days. Let me check on these repair numbers. Or if you get it under contract, you have time. Right now, I think that speed is kind of, most people that are calling you either from whatever marketing, your direct mail, your, PPC, your Google ads, whatever it is, you're probably not the only person that they are talking to, unless it's like a referral from a friend or somebody from church or whatever it is. So I think speed is kind of the name of the game. So with that being said, sometimes you have to kind of just do it on a whim, so you can definitely, when you're first starting, you have to take that chance, right? You have to get somebody that knows what they're doing, somebody that knows the repair cost to go out there and say, hey, yes, it's going to take, $30,000 like you mentioned, or no, hey, you were way off. There's this foundation issue. They're going to put steel beams up in the basement, waterproof it, put a sump pump. That's going to be another $18,000 right there. So back to your point about putting it under contract, if you're first starting, I would just be upfront with everybody and say, look, I think this is what it needs. Let's go ahead and put it under contract. I just need a 15, 20-day inspection period just to make sure all my numbers are right, and then we can go, we can go from there. So I would suggest doing that if you're first starting. If you're kind of, if let's say you're a handyman and you're wanting to flip your first house, if you're pretty confident on your numbers, I would try to close it as quick as you can, because there's always a chance somebody goes behind you, offers more, they want to back out of the contract, whatever it is. But long story short, I would definitely get maybe not an official inspection done, like a home inspection, but somebody you trust that is going to tell you the correct repair.
There's really this fine line, right? The fine line is speed and being careful.
Yeah.
Like, that's the fine line. You want to close as quickly as possible, get that thing locked up, but you also have to be very careful, because we're talking about making mistakes, like missing repair costs. And you come in and say it needs $20,000 and it really needs $30,000, well, then your numbers change. And even if you're borrowing money, you've got to go back to whoever you're borrowing money from. So there's always something like that.
Well, I'll say too, I don't know if you've ever been to an auction, but you get caught up in the bidding, right? So like I used to buy cars and I would go to the auction and you're like, okay, I'm not going to pay more than $5,000 for this car. And then somebody else offers $5,500. You're like, well, what's $5,600? I can do that. Before you know it, it's at $8,000 and your numbers are completely blown out of the water. So kind of the same way when I walk into these houses, I'll walk in on the table. There's 7 other postcards from 7 different companies. And I'm like, man, I've got to get this locked up today, because I've got to get this under contract, because if not, somebody else is going to get it. So like I'll totally browse over some of the things that I should have been looking for, because I'm just thinking I got to get this deal. I got to do this. I still do it to this day. I'll miss things,
That's right.
So,
yeah, that is the challenge. I mean, and so what I always tell investors is just be super disciplined to the number, and don't get so caught up in having to have that house that you, again, kind of make those mistakes. But it is tempting, because especially when you, like, for a lot of people that are probably listening to this podcast, it's kind of their part-time job, right? It's kind of something they're doing on the side. But when you're doing it full-time, like, the lifeblood of your business, the oxygen you need to breathe is buying these houses and selling them. So you're much more motivated to get those things done.
Well, we talked about our friend Brian Miles too. I like about Brian, one of the things I like about him is he will make an offer based on his numbers no matter what. So like, I'll get into a house and somebody will say, well, I really I've got this other offer for $215. Well, maybe my offer was going to be $199, but I'm like, man, like you were just talking about, I need this house. I want this house. I can come up to $215 or whatever, or $216, and that way I know I'll get it. Even though I may be shooting myself in the foot later on down the road because I didn't account for something. But Brian, he will go in there and say, if they want $95,000, he'll say, no, I can give you $40,000. I'm going to stick to that. That's my. And then sometimes he gets them, sometimes he doesn't. But he knows if he gets it, it's a great deal.
Otherwise, he walks away.
That's right. Yeah, he just walks away. He was like, nope, I can't do that. Maybe he'll come up a few thousand every now and then. But I like that about Brian. I'm bad about trying to how can I get this deal versus he makes the numbers because he knows what's going to work because he's super conservative. I think you have to be kind of a mix of that. I think you have to be very conservative, especially when you're starting. But also, if you're doing it full time, you have to keep deals coming in.
Yeah, I was just with Brian the other day looking at houses, and he took me to a house that he just got under contract, and in Fairfield, and I was like, "Hey, just sell that to me. Just take my $2,000 and sell that to me."
Yeah.
And he was like, "There is no way I'm giving you this house."
That's right.
Once he gets them, he knows he's got a good deal.
Yeah, that's
the
right.
good thing about it. All right, number 3. Let's talk about this one. This is a mistake you say that flippers make, not checking for major items.
Yeah, and there again, I know it sounds like common sense, but when you're walking through a house, and we say major items, I mean foundation, septic, roof, HVAC, insulation, and is it in a flood zone? So like if you're using hard money, sometimes, like my hard money lender I work with, I work with him so much. Like if I get a deal, he just knows it's just a deal, right? So I've gotten it before where I've gotten a house under contract and it was in a flood zone, and I totally I didn't even check it, right? I said, oh, this is a great area. This is in a flood zone. If you don't know, when you go to try to sell it on the retail market, yes, you can do it, but it's going to be harder. People don't love to live in a flood zone, and you have to have flood insurance if you're getting it through a mortgage company. So that's an extra $100 to $200 a month, depending on the price of the house. So anyway, all the major items, not checking them. So these days, I think back in the early 2000s, and correct me if I'm wrong, but early 2000s up until before before the crash, you could buy a house. If the HVAC was 10 years old, 15 years old, but it was still in good working condition, you could leave it, right? Same thing with the roof. If it was 8, 9 years old, but it was in good shape, you could leave it. You don't have to worry about it. Today, what I'm seeing and what I'm talking to agents about is, the old, hey, let's put it on the market. There's going to be somebody out there because it's in a good area that wants to fix it up as they live there.
Right.
Interest rates are so high right now. Price of houses have gone up substantially since 2020 and definitely since early 2000s, where nobody really they don't want to get a loan on something they have to put money into, right? So they want everything 5 years or newer, new HVAC, new roof, everything. So, I have to tell people that all the time. Like, look, maybe if it's 5 or 6 years old on the HVAC and the roof, you can get away with it. But if you want to sell it quickly, you might as well do all the major items. So that's kind of what I mean with the major items. Like an HVAC, if you say, oh, well, HVAC's working, you can feel it when you go into the house. It's cool in there. And maybe you glance at the unit, but you don't realize that it's 24 years old when you look at the serial number, So I just mean, check the serial numbers on the unit. Most of the time there's a manufacturer date or you can look it up on their website, whatever. The roof, I always try to ask the homeowners. That's not necessarily the best because most of them don't keep receipts and all that. But they'll say, oh, yeah, I think it's only 3 or 4 years old. Well, maybe 15 years old, but time gets away from everybody, right? So I mentioned a house that I did. It was actually over in 35235 around the Roebuck area. I had this house. It was a great house, just needed a full cosmetic, everything. I was so caught up in getting the deal, I didn't even put my head up in the attic, which is stupid, right? There could be all kinds of issues in the attic. But when we got ready to sell it, I got up in the attic. There was zero insulation in the house. I don't know where it went. I don't know if it ever had insulation, zero insulation in the attic. So I had to get $2,500 worth of insulation blown into the attic. Wasn't a deal killer, but that was $2,500 less than what I'm taking home.
Yeah, 100%. You would have factored that into your offer.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Had you known it, right?
Yeah. And so I'll say checking all the major items, your HVAC, even if it's working, make sure it's I think the rule of thumb is typically 5 years or older. You can keep it, and this is all just a guideline, right? It's up to each individual person, each individual market, but the flood zone, that's a major thing. So you may be in an area where it never floods, right? There's never any kind of standing water, but it's technically in a flood zone. And if it's on that FEMA map, it's on that flood map, the bank is going to require 10 times out of 10 for you to have flood insurance when you're getting a mortgage. So on the selling side, that's just going to make it a lot easier if it's not in a flood zone. Yep. I think the main thing is foundation, right? So when I first got into it, especially when you're wholesaling, you don't know what to look for. You don't know how much foundation stuff costs. I've had this at a house that I've lived in where, you especially ones that are on a hill, right? Where the hill, you walk out the backyard and it goes up a slope. All that pressure, that hydrostatic pressure, that water running off the hill is coming onto those basement walls, especially if they're cinder block walls, which are probably 90% of the ones I look at instead of the poured concrete. So you can see water seeping in, you can see separation, you can see stair step cracks, all that kind of stuff. An inspector is going to nail you on when you go to resell it. So, you can factor in, I don't know of a foundation that you can't get fixed for, less than 15 grand. That, maybe there are some out there, but on average, I think it's around 15 grand to have steel support beams put up or whatever the inspector tells you have to have. But that's just something you have to factor in.
Do you find foundation issues an advantage to you? Because what I've seen is, like, I've got a friend here in town who used to flip a lot of houses, Bruce. You may have met Bruce.
Bruce Glenn?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bruce, he loved foundation issues because he knew it scared most investors away.
Oh, yeah.
So he was like, I'll buy them because he was just used to dealing with them.
Yeah, yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, it doesn't scare me away. The problem is, I don't know too many people that are scared of them these days. Like right now, if it's unless it's just major, like falling off the foundation type, and those are probably even too bad for Glenn to buy sometimes,
Right.
But if it's on that borderline of like, man, this might be condemned versus being able to fix it. But it doesn't scare me away, but I don't think it scares. There's a lot of guys that flip 4 to 10 houses a month in Birmingham. It's probably not going to scare them.
Yeah, it's not going to scare them. But for the first time flipper, maybe they want to stay away from the huge foundation issues.
Yeah, yeah.
If they don't know how much it's going to cost.
Exactly, yeah. So, there's guys out here, there's foundation companies here that will give you a quote for free. So, you could always get a quote, and kind of what we talked about with the inspection period. If you're kind of worried about the repair cost, and let's say you've got everything else nailed down, you're like, okay, HVAC's good, roof's good, all this kind of stuff, but cosmetic, let's say it's going to cost me 20 or 30 grand, but there's this one foundation issue you overlooked. That's where your inspection period comes in. You could say, hey, I just want to double check. Let me get a foundation guy out there to give me a quote. If it comes back 15 or 20,000, then like you were saying, you go back and renegotiate.
Yep.
You know? So,
all right, let's move on. This is a big one right here. Number 4 is finding good contractors and then understanding how to pay them. Like this has always been like, and doesn't matter how experienced you are. This is always something you have to pay attention to.
Yep, that's right. So I've only had one really bad experience with contractors. It's always an issue. I mean, typically there's one head contractor that you can hire, and I don't hire like big companies that, you know, are in your, or, you know, that you Google and you find, you know, just for like regular homeowners getting repairs done. You know, there's certain crews that, you know, I've just come across either referrals or whatever. Great work, but they're going to be substantially cheaper, you know, but this is what they do full time.
Yeah.
You know? So anyway, most of the time there's one head guy and he's got a crew of guys that work for him. But, you know, I've never had a contractor that was a good contractor that asked for money up front. So, you know, I've learned over the years talking to flippers, like, hey, you never pay anybody up front. You know, they're going to get paid. If there's materials that need to be bought, you can always pay for it at the counter, which is what I do most of the time. Yeah. But you have to give contractors draws based on the amount of work they've done. So let's say that there's Antonio. He's a guy that's done several houses for me, does a really great job, shows up on time every time. We'll walk through a house. Antonio will tell me, hey, you know, we can do it for X number of dollars, and it'll take us four weeks, right? Well, I know at the end of week 1, if you know, that would, let's say it's $20,000 over 4 weeks. If $5,000 of work is not done in week 1, you know, I'll say, hey, look, I can give you $3,000 this week because this is where we're at in the repair process.
Right.
You know? So,
but that's what you want to do. You like at the end of the day, these people, they want to be paid on a Friday for the most part. They want to have the money for the weekend. And so that's kind of the way you need to set your draw system up, right? Is on a weekly basis over however many weeks it's going to take to get the job done. Yep,
that's right. So, you know, I do it based on, like I said, every week, because even if there's, like Antonio has guys that work for him, he kind of oversees different projects. I know if I pay him on Friday, he's got to pay his guys because they're expecting to get paid. Yep. So that's just something you have to work out with them. I would just say the number one thing is, you know, if they've got other work that you can see, most contractors that I interview, and this is just very informal, like I'll talk to them in person, they'll show you pictures. Hey, this is this house I did, this house. Most of the time it's referrals from other flippers that I know, so you can kind of judge it based on the kind of person they are. But yeah, I would just say make sure you don't pay them up front and only pay them as it goes along, right? Because you don't want to be, and I've done this before, where, you know, I've paid somebody, you know, they said, hey, I've just got to finish up these few little checklist items. And I say, okay, well, I really don't want to drive an hour away. Let me go ahead and pay you today this extra $2,000. And then it's 2 or 3 weeks getting them back out there because, you know, they've already gotten paid.
Yeah, that's right. The motivation has been paid out of them.
That's right, yeah. And I get it. If I was already paid for the job, my motivation would be probably out the door as well.
That's right.
So.
All right, that's a big one. You know, we see this all the time. Even when you have rentals and you're rehabbing them, you just have to be very, very careful, and especially in both of these instances, whether you're flipping them or whether you're holding for rental, time is money, and the longer, like, contractors can draw things out. If you don't find the right people, this thing could be drawn out for months longer than it should be. And what is that holding cost doing to you?
That's
and
right.
For a real estate investor who's buying rentals, what is that vacancy doing to you? I mean, you're not only paying more for the holding cost, but then you don't have anybody paying you, nobody living in that house. And it's a big problem.
Well, really quickly, let's talk about, we talked about this before we started. So holding cost, you know, I've got wholesalers that send me stuff all the time. You know, like we mentioned earlier, they send me deals and they say, well, you can make, you know, based on the numbers you told me, you could buy it for X and you could sell it for Y. You could make $39,000 on this house. I was talking to a guy on Facebook that I'm trying to educate this guy and say, hey, send me deals that fit this criteria. Well, he said, I don't get it. You can make $39,000 on this house based on the numbers you gave me. And I said, how'd you get that? He said, you know, this number minus this number, that's $39,000. And I said, okay, well, how am I going to sell it? And he was like, what do you mean? And I said, well, okay, so when I sell it, I've got to pay an experienced agent that knows what they're doing, 2.5% on one side, 2.5% on the other. That's 5% for buying and selling agents. And then you've got usually around 3 or 4% in closing costs because, inevitably a buyer is always going to ask for assistance or, concessions or rate buy down, whatever it is. If not, that's great, but you have to factor it in. So let's just say 9%. Well, you take 9% of the sales price. I think in this case it was $22,000. So that $39,000 minus that $22,000 turned into, $14,000-15,000 very quickly from you're going to make 39. Well, now you're going to make 14 or 15. 14 or 15 is a very, very skinny deal when you're flipping a house. 3 or 4 months of work, all the headaches.
It's a lot of risk.
It's a lot of risk. And, that's if everything goes perfectly. That's if you got the ARV correctly. You don't have to drop the price. That's if you put all your numbers exactly correct, which I've only went under budget one time, or on budget, I guess, not even under budget, exactly on budget because stuff comes up.
Right.
So anyway, I just want to mention that some of this stuff you don't realize what goes into it. So you just have to be really tight on your numbers.
Yeah, you're looking at gross. It's easy to look at gross numbers, but you need to understand that's basically an estimate, and then you need to get real detailed and take everything out. That's more than likely going to happen, because, through the whole process.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the last one, number 5. This is contingencies. Essentially, I don't know how you were saying it, but contingencies for unexpected things that come up. There's always something that happens in a house that you didn't expect.
Yeah, so just like I was talking about with the insulation, right? So that was a $2,500
Well, that was your fault.
That was my fault. Yeah. All of it's going to be my fault because I'm the one looking at it. I'm the one saying, hey, I'm going to buy it for this price. So in my opinion...
But sometimes you're going to uncover stuff during the demo or something like that that's there's no way I could have known this.
I guess so, yeah. So maybe. Maybe. Let's say you've got an unfinished basement. You'll say you got a finished basement and it's got, maybe there's foundation issues behind it, but you've got to replace the drywall. You can't see any of that until you pull it down. Then you're like, oh man, we've got issues.
It was a mistake, yeah.
So, but stuff and I've had it one time where it wasn't a deal killer, but this guy had pegboard all over the garage where he was hanging his tools. All the other basement walls looked good, but there was, some slight cracks and stuff in this basement, but it was all behind the pegboard, so you couldn't see it, right? So you can't say, hey, I got to take the pegboard down to go look at it, because it was all filled with tools. The guy was still living there, so stuff like that's going to come up. You got to put in a buffer for it, right? So I try to add in 5% on top of 5 to 10% on whatever my repair costs are, just to account for that, right? So one house that I did a couple years ago, I had a budget of $60,000 on it for the repair costs. I ended up spending $72,000 on it. That was the house with the insulation that I missed, and then I missed a couple of other things in that whole process that I didn't account for. Right? I think it was some extra granite. There was a mother-in-law suite downstairs, and it was going to have a new countertops, and I didn't account for that. But regardless, there was a lot of little issues that I didn't account for. So it's always good to put a buffer in there. Like I said, sometimes when you're trying to compete in a very competitive market, you can't always do that, but it's always good if you can. So
if you figured out a $60,000 rehab, you're saying, hey, add another $3,000 to that just to be safe, because something's going to come up.
Yeah. And I'll say that probably the worst. I always add another. Let's say $3,000 or $4,000. If you have to take that buffer out to get the deal, that's kind of up to you. But it's always great to have one. But probably the worst mistake I've made, I did a burned house in Dora, Alabama. Dora is about 30 miles outside of Birmingham.
Yeah.
So
it's kind of a remote area.
Yeah. It's kind of remote, but it was this was a pretty good established subdivision, pretty close to the interstate, so people could jump on, they could live there, work in Birmingham, whatever. This was a fire damaged house. The ARV in this neighborhood was $215,000, and we get this house for $30,000, right? So we bought this house for $30,000. I mean, it was a burn job, right? It was down to the studs. It did not go through the roof, but it was what they called gatored. When wood gets burned, it's like that flaky looking,
right,
like the back of a alligator. Yeah. So anyway, we said, okay, we got a contractor in there. I think he gave us $50,000 for the burn, and then another. It was going to be a $60,000 or $70,000 rehab. But we said, well, even if we put $70,000 into it, we're buying it for $30,000. We can make a decent amount of money. I was partnering with a guy on this. So what we didn't realize, we got inspectors involved and all this kind of stuff. And the water, so when we bought the house, two things. water had been sitting for like 4 months on this carpet, right? So it seeped all into the subfloor. We didn't realize we pulled that carpet up. All the subfloor was just almost rotten, right? So like a 4x8 sheet of plywood or, decking for subfloor, that stuff's expensive. So that was another $5,000 to $7,000 we didn't account for. But the biggest mistake was, and I don't know how we really would have known and just out of experience, but the roof trusses, right? So like the drywall was gone. You could see the gaitered, roof trusses or whatever didn't go all the way through the roof. So we said, okay, we can just replace, these beams across here. Shouldn't be a big deal. Well, the inspector comes out and said, hey, this is a prefabricated home. So it's not a mobile home, but this was a subdivision they built. Basically take the house in 2 pieces. They built it in a factory, ship it out in 2 pieces, and they put it together on site, right? You would never be able to tell just by looking at these houses. Right. But this is a big thing they used to do, I think, in the 60s and 70s. It's like these prefabbed homes in this area. He said, you can't just stick build this, right? You can't just replace, you have to have these roof trusses engineered by an engineer, and they have to specifically build these trusses to fit this house. And I said, okay, hold on a second, back up. What do you mean? You lost me, right? He said, okay, you're going to have to hire an engineer, and they're going to have to do all the measurements, all this kind of stuff, and then you're going to have a truss company build these trusses. And I said, well, how are we going to get it in there? He said, you got to pull the roof off the top of the house. You got to drop them in from the top. So here I go from, okay, there's about 15, 20 boards that need to be replaced to we're pulling the roof off this thing and dropping trusses with a crane in the top of this house. So anyway, I found this, I think it was a Builder's First Source out in Chelsea. They would actually send somebody out to measure it, an engineer. They built the trusses. It was like $7,000 or $8,000 for the trusses, but then, we had to had a good metal roof on it, but we had to pull, the roof off of it and then put the trusses in. It was like a $20,000 mistake. So this $70,000 total in rehab turned into like $90,000, $95,000. We still had room to make it work because we got it so cheap, but had we just gone by a standard repair number, we would have lost money on it, right?
Right,
so
that's right.
We got this one so cheap, and then on the sales side, this was in 2022, house prices were starting to interest rates were starting to creep up. We had it at $215. We had to drop it to $199 to sell it. So we ended up making like $20,000 a piece on it, but this was like a 6 or 7 month process.
A lot of risk.
Lots of risk, all this kind of stuff. So anyway, that's kind of what I mean by, giving yourself a buffer. And that's an extreme example, but there's going to be things that come up that you're just not accounting for, right? Yeah. Every time I know, I'm like, hey, how can I find out if this is a prefab home? Is it a burn job? I don't know if I'll ever do another burn job again just because of the issues I had with it. But if it's in a good neighborhood and the numbers work.
But this is what I love about that story is that now you check, is this a prefab home? Like you're like all of these lessons that you're learning, all these lessons that I've learned, it's like another tool in your tool belt that you're able to use next time you go look at a house. Yeah. That makes you a better and better investor. Yeah. And then the next thing you know, you've got 10 years of investing experience and you can figure most things out. Well,
I hate this about the real estate world. I absolutely hate it. But the more stuff you go through, people think you're just, oh man, you're super smart. I can't believe you thought about that. No. Let's back up. I am not super smart. I was an idiot over here because I didn't know. Right. And like I've had these title issues, or I've had this burned house that I didn't make as much money as I thought. So no, it's bad beats, and like you learn through going through the process.
Yeah.
So
so this guy Ray Dalio, he has several principles, and one of my favorite principles that he has is pain plus reflection equals progress, and that's what it is. It's like, hey, you go through some pain. You reflect on it, you learn from it, and then guess what? That equals progress because the next time you don't make the same mistakes. Mm-hmm. Hopefully. Sometimes it takes making the same mistake 2 or 3 times before you really wake up and go, oh, I need to pay attention.
Humans are hard-headed. We're stubborn.
We're very stubborn, yeah. Especially if you have a type A personality and you're okay with risk and you tend to go for things. But I think even like stories like that make you go, man, I could have wholesaled a house and made $20,000. Instead, I went through 7 months of struggle to make that $20,000 or whatever. But that's the whole thing. It's like you learn so much, but you get better and better and better. And so
Well, I post all this stuff like on social media, and I show people like we talked about before we started, the hoarder houses, all that kind of stuff, and like, hey, don't do this because this is where I just messed up. People are like, oh, all the stuff you do is so interesting. I'm like, well, you don't realize the level of stress. Yeah, sure, it's interesting to an outsider watching it, and sure, it's not a 9 to 5 where I'm just going in, hitting the time clock, and leaving. It is interesting. It's different every day, which is why I love real estate, but sometimes it's going to hurt while you're getting to where you want to be.
And also what they're seeing is a 60-second clip when you're you're having to deal with this for weeks on end.
Months,
right?
yeah, sometimes,
months on end. And so it's interesting on a clip, but it's not so interesting when you've got a squatter in your house and it's taking you months to get the person out.
That's right. Yep.
All right, this has been good. Thanks, Adam. Biggest mistakes flipping houses. So learn from these mistakes, apply it to your own situation, and maybe, who knows, maybe this podcast just saved you 20 grand. That'd be fantastic.
I hope so.
Right?
Yeah,
I hope so. Absolutely. All right, everybody, that's it for this episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Evernest Real Estate Investor Podcast.